Super fights, dream fights. The fights we've always wanted to see have been a hot topic in the UFC, but they're called dream fights for a reason. Thanks to issues like injuries, legal problems, chickening out at the last moment, we've seen a lot of super thrilling bouts get canceled. From rivalries to championship fights, here are some of the most awaited scheduled matchups that, unfortunately, never saw the light of day. First up, Evans versus Rua. Shogun Rua and Rashad Evans were once regarded as two of the world's best light heavyweights, and as you can imagine, fans were super thrilled to see these two face off in the ring. Rua had previously defeated Lyoto Machida in a knockout at UFC 113 to win the light heavyweight title, and he had found the perfect opponent in Rashad Evans for his first title defense at UFC 128. Unfortunately, though, Evans had to withdraw due to an injury, and Jon Jones stepped up, easily defeating Rua. The match between Rua and Evans was rescheduled for April 16, 2016, but the Brazilian withdrew in favor of competing. It would have been amazing to witness a fight between these two legendary light heavyweights. Rua had already established himself as a Muay Thai knockout machine, and Evans' striking had significantly improved, but sadly, fans will never get to see the two fight. Moving on to another heartbreak, Dominick Cruz versus Renan Barão. Fans were robbed of the most eagerly anticipated bantamweight championship fight in UFC history thanks to Dominick Cruz's never-ending injuries. Cruz was slated to coach against Uriah Faber on The Ultimate Fighter and face his opponent for the third time after successfully defending the UFC Bantamweight Championship twice, but he suffered an ACL tear and needed 2 surgeries. Meanwhile, Renan Barão had won the interim UFC Bantamweight Championship and quickly rose through the bantamweight ranks. Before Cruz was even prepared to return to action and defend his undisputed title at UFC 169, Barão successfully defended his belt twice. Unfortunately, Cruz tore his groin a month earlier, and his injury streak kept ruining his career. He was forced to give up his belt, and the fight was never held. Next up, Robert Whittaker versus Luke Rockhold. The MMA community would have enjoyed watching the much-anticipated middleweight title fight between Robert Whittaker and Luke Rockhold. The two were slated to square off at UFC 221 at the time as two of the top 3 middleweights in the world. But unfortunately, Whittaker was forced to withdraw because a stomach staph infection wasn't properly treated. Whittaker was replaced by Yoel Romero, who knocked out Rockhold. Since then, Rockhold has advanced to the light heavyweight, while Whittaker remains one of the top 3 middleweights in the world. Now, for Junior Dos Santos versus Brock Lesnar. It's always super disappointing when the Ultimate Fighter coaches end up not competing against one another after a massive hype is built around it everywhere, including television. This is what actually happened after Junior Dos Santos and Brock Lesnar coached against one another for several weeks on The Ultimate Fighter 13. At the time, this fight was one of the biggest the UFC could stage, and having them square off on the infamous UFC show only served to increase interest. Unfortunately, Lesnar withdrew from the fight because of a persistent diverticulitis condition, and Shane Carwin took his place. The bout between Dos Santos and Carwin wasn't short of entertainment either, with the Brazilian defeating his new opponent, but it just wasn't Junior Dos Santos versus Brock Lesnar. Given that Lesnar at the time was arguably the biggest pay-per-view draw in the UFC, a matchup with him could have been a huge opportunity for Dos Santos. Next up, Jon Jones versus Anthony Johnson. Another thrilling face-off we were brutally robbed of. Fans were salivating for some serious MMA action. It would have taken place during the fight for the light heavyweight title between Jon Jones and Anthony Johnson. This was undoubtedly the most anticipated title defense for Jon Jones at the time. It was supposed to be a power puncher versus a well-rounded MMA strategist. Sadly, though, the former champion got into some trouble after being named the primary offender in a hit-and-run incident. Jones was stripped of his belt and he was put on suspension. Because of this, the suspenseful light heavyweight match was never held, leaving fans to wonder if Johnson had a puncher's chance. Let's look at the fight between Jon Jones and Dan Henderson. On another rare but shocking occasion, not just the fight, but the whole event was called off. In an extremely unusual circumstance, the failure of the Jon Jones versus Dan Henderson fight led to the cancellation of the entire event. Henderson was forced to withdraw due to injuries from Jones's 4th title defense against him at UFC 151 in 2012. Jones was counseled by his coach, Greg Jackson, not to accept the fight, even though Shael Sonnen offered to step in at the last minute. There wasn't enough time for him to prepare, with only a few days left in his training camp, and with so many problems popping up, the entire event was eventually called off. Moving on to Anthony Pettis versus Jose Aldo. For a brief period, Anthony Pettis' decision to move down to featherweight to challenge Jose Aldo for the UFC featherweight title instead of vying for the lightweight title meant that we were about to witness arguably the most anticipated super fight a fan could have hoped for at the time. The two were scheduled to face each other at UFC 163 on August 3, 2013, but Pettis withdrew due to a knee injury. Aldo then faced Chan Sung Young, who he defeated by fourth-round TKO to keep his 145-pound title. The match against Aldo was never rescheduled because Pettis went on to challenge Benson Henderson for the UFC Lightweight Championship at UFC 164 in Milwaukee, where he eventually defeated Henderson by first-round armbar to win the title. Next up, Rafael dos Anjos versus Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor was on an impressive UFC run following his record-breaking featherweight title victory over Jose Aldo at UFC 194, where he knocked him out in just 13 seconds. He then made an attempt to upset challenger Rafael dos Anjos, the lightweight champion at the time, at UFC 196. Sadly, dos Anjos had to withdraw due to a broken foot, and Nate Diaz was brought in to fight McGregor at welterweight instead. McGregor suffered his first UFC defeat at the hands of Diaz, who stunned the world by submitting him in the second round. Dos Anjos later lost his lightweight championship to Eddie Alvarez. Years later, dos Anjos, a welterweight, is still advocating for the rematch and is ready to take on McGregor at 170 or 155 pounds. Let's look at Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier. Nate Diaz scheduled the UFC 230 fight with Dustin Poirier for November 3, 2018, which was supposed to be his eagerly anticipated comeback, was another bout that never happened. There was a lot of confusion in this one, starting with Diaz storming out of the press conference in Los Angeles, followed by tweets from both Diaz and Poirier stating that they would not be fighting on that show, and ending with Poirier withdrawing due to a hip injury. Poirier continued by stating that he underwent surgery because he thought Diaz was playing too many games and that the fight might not have actually taken place. Honestly, we most likely missed out on a fight of the year contender, and for the longest time, it appeared like Poirier was still enthusiastic about the fight. While we do hope that the fight will eventually happen given the history involved, we're also not really holding our breath for this one. Last but not the least, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. It doesn't happen often that two superstar fighters are scheduled to fight against each other not once, twice, but 5 times in 5 years, and still never cross paths in the ring. It never happened thanks to a string of unfortunate events and injuries. The first booking was in December 2015 during the Ultimate Fighter finale card, but Khabib was forced to leave due to injury and Edson Barboza took his place. Ferguson Darce's choke submission of Barboza in the second round earned him Performance and Fight of the Night bonuses. Then in April 2016, they were supposed to square off at UFC on Fox 19, but Ferguson withdrew this time. He was replaced by the relatively unknown Daryl Horcher, who Khabib battered before, winning via second-round TKO. Then in March 2017, a fight for the interim lightweight title was set to take place at UFC 209, but it was postponed due to Khabib becoming ill from a poor weight cut. If this hasn't frustrated the daylights out of you, here's more. The two were set to meet for the 4th time. Ferguson, the interim lightweight champion at the time, and Khabib were set to square off for the undisputed lightweight championship at UFC 223 in 2018, but Ferguson tripped over a wire in a freak accident, blowing out his knee. Then in 2020, there were talks of a face-off between the two once again, but nothing came of it. As of today, Ferguson is no longer regarded as a top lightweight contender, and Khabib has retired. Unfortunately, this fight was never meant to happen for UFC fans. And that's a wrap for this video. What was your dream fight that never took place? Comment below and let us know. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more. See you in the next one.